Good afternoon, or good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be. I want to welcome everyone to LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and director of the Thelen United States Center here at the LSE, which is hosting today's event. Today's discussion is part of the U.S. Center's Public Events Lecture Series. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Professor Paul Pierson of the University of California, Berkeley, and Professor Kathleen Thelen of MIT. They're here to talk about their new book, American Political Economy, Politics, Markets, and Power, co-edited with Jacob Hacker and Alexander Hertel-Fernandez, published by Cambridge University Press. This is a major effort to revive the moribund study of American political economy, drawing on insights from fields ranging from American politics to comparative political economy to public policy. And we were keen to get them to join us to talk about the book and how it might help us better understand this historical moment in the United States and possible paths forward. Briefly, by way of introduction, Paul Pierson is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. His teaching and research interests span the fields of American politics, comparative political economy, public policy, and social theory. He's the author or co-author of numerous articles and books, including Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class with Jacob Hacker. In addition to his many academic writings, Paul writes actively about public affairs for venues such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Republic. Kathleen Thelen is the Ford Professor of Political Science at MIT and a permanent external member of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. Her work centers on the origins and evolution of the political economies of Western democracies. She's also the author of many articles and books, including the award-winning Varieties of Liberalization and the New Politics of Social Solidarity. Former president of the American Political Science Association, Kathy has received many other professional honors and awards, including an honorary doctorate from the LSE. A few words about format before we get started here. Kathy and Paul will get us started with a 25 to 30-minute summary of the book and its core arguments. We'll then open it up for discussion. We've left plenty of time for questions, so please don't be shy. You can send your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll do my level best to put as many of them as possible to Kathy and Paul during the discussion period. So normally at this point, I would ask you all to put your hands together to give our speakers one of those warm LSE welcomes that we are famous for. That, of course, is not possible today. So in lieu of applause, I encourage you to pose questions in the Q&A period. Kathy and Paul, welcome to LSE's online platform. It's really great to have you with us.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter, for that introduction, and also just for this opportunity to talk to you guys about the work that we've been doing. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Sorry, I managed to. Okay, so somebody give me a
Good.
thumbs up that it's got it. Okay. Okay, well, the first point of the book is that this book is really a team effort, and as Peter mentioned, Paul and I are only half of the team actually. The team also includes Jacob Hacker and Alex Hertel-Fernandez, and actually the book itself was an even bigger team effort because we were able to solicit contributions from an absolutely extraordinary group of comparativists and Americanists, including David and Lucy Barnes and maybe others who are here today. So by way of background, the book is really kind of a centerpiece of a broader project. which is being funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and where the goal is really to try to cultivate a new field within political science that is really specifically devoted to understanding the interaction of markets and governance, or capitalism and democracy within the United States. The inspiration for the book actually was Peter's really influential volume David's with Peter Hall, Varieties of Capitalism, which was just hugely important in kind of shaping the way that we all think about the way that comparative political economy came to be studied. And our goal with this book, kind of similarly, was really also to try to set an agenda, to really reorient the study of American politics in a couple of different ways. First, by really kind of expanding the substantive reach, the range of issues that are addressed. So moving beyond the kind of heavy focus in most of the mainstream politics on American politics that is on elections and public opinion, to really include a much wider range of issues that we think are centrally important to understanding contemporary politics and contemporary political economic outcomes in the United States. So things like finance, the role of finance in the American political economy, how business interests are organized and how they engage in politics. Secondly, we think it's really important to kind of expand the field of vision in the study of American politics, sort of moving beyond the current pretty heavy focus on Congress and the presidency to really start to consider the full range of venues where extremely consequential political outcomes are getting decided. So the bureaucracy, the courts, which is hugely important, the realm of local politics, all of these are really hugely important sites of political contestation, but that we think are really kind of underappreciated and certainly understudied in the American context. And then third, we want to try to extend the temporal horizons in terms of the way that people think about American politics or politics generally, sort of drawing attention to the way in which historically evolved, entrenched institutions and policy structures really operate to constrain and shape contemporary outcomes. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So from what I've already said, I think it should be pretty clear that our project draws a lot of inspiration from the really long tradition of research in comparative political economy that is, of course, centrally concerned with studying the interactions of markets and governance in the rich democracies. And like that literature, ours is an approach that is methodologically eclectic. The unifying theme here is not any single method, but really an effort to understand the particular patterns of economic governance in the United States. Now, comparative research or comparative political economy has already taught us a whole lot, of course, about variation in the political economies and political economic outcomes across the rich democracies. But we think that there's really a lot more that can be said about the particular dynamics of American capitalism, partly because the US is just a hugely important case, but also because we think it is still kind of imperfectly understood or sort of also understudied, even in the context of the comparative research. Now, one of the things that, of course, pops out of the comparative research is that on a whole lot of dimensions, the US is really an outlier. And sometimes a really extreme outlier. So one kind of obvious example that's kind of drawn a lot of attention recently is income inequality. So on the left, you see a figure that really groups a bunch of West European countries together to show trends in the share of national income going to the bottom 50%, that's in the blue line, and then the top 1%, which is in red. And this is all since 1980. And at least at that highly aggregated level, you don't see like enormous changes. But the picture is obviously really different for the United States. So if you look at the right, you have the share of national income going to the top 1%, which you see has completely taken off, even as the bottom 50% have really suffered a huge decline. But that's really just one example. And there are just so many dimensions on which the American political economy is really pretty distinctive. And it's distinctive in ways that we think can be really instructive and hold some really important general lessons for political economy of the rich democracies generally. So the components of the kind of approach we're advocating, it really emphasizes features of the political economy that are pretty well established in the comparative political economic research, but not that central really to the way that mainstream scholarship, especially in the US, approaches the study of American politics. Right. So one aspect of this is really paying attention to institutional configurations, by which we mean sort of the interactions across different institutions and levels of governance, and also between the institutions of the market and the institutions of governance. So there are just a lot of dynamics that we think the mainstream American research is kind of missing, partly because Americanists in the US tend to sort of specialize in the study of different institutions. You know, you have scholars of Congress and people who study state politics, people who study the courts. But an important component of the approach that we're advocating is really to focus on the interaction of political and market actors, not just within, but also across this whole landscape, across these various venues. So related to this, the approach that we're sort of advocating also pays attention to the kind of coalitional patterns that shape, that take form within the context of this landscape. So again, going beyond the kind of dyadic relationship between policymakers and voters, which is really at the heart of so much mainstream American politics, but also looking at the coalitions, and particularly the coalitions between parties and organized interests that shape how voter preferences are, articulated, whose voices are, elevated, whose voices are marginalized, and how all of that translates into political outcomes. And then finally, the perspective that we're advocating is one that's really attuned to the fact that the particular configurations that shape political economic outcomes today are the product of really long-term developmental processes. So, and this is more than just the kind of anodyne observation that history matters. We're trying to really take seriously the fact that contemporary arrangements are not somehow the result of natural market forces. They're the product of previous cycles of political contestation. And as such, they, reflect, but they also, of course, reproduce and in many ways reinforce many of the power asymmetries that those previous battles generated, and that endow certain kinds of actors with enduring advantages over others. So the way that we have kind of come to think about how to summarize our approach is in its focus on what we are calling metapolitics. So, a lot of contemporary American mainstream research is really focused on mass politics, what we're kind of thinking of as sort of the last mile politics, all of the kind of electoral maneuvering and policy wrangling that is most visible and that's actually most openly contested. Whereas we would like to draw attention to the really enormously consequential politics that led up to these more visible choice points, right? So paying attention to these previous conflicts and the legacies of these previous conflicts that really shape the terrain on which these last mile politics are getting played out. But also, and I would say equally important, we're trying to pay attention to the strategic maneuvering of the most powerful actors and how that weighs on the choice sets that we face at any given moment. So we're focusing on these processes of institution shaping, agenda setting, and venue arbitrage or venue shopping that we think have a really profound impact on politics. So all of these are hugely consequential, but they're virtually invisible because they form the sort of background or starting point for contemporary politics. And as such, they're kind of taken as accepted or natural or sort of taken for granted features of the political landscape. These are the features that we think a lot of mainstream American work is not that well equipped to answer or to even capture, not least because Americanists tend not to compare the US to any other system. And because, these are precisely the features that only come into view if you're situating the American case within a broader comparative perspective. So applying this kind of lens brings us to highlight three features of the American political economy that we think are both really distinctive and actually enormously consequential. And so these are the three features that are highlighted on this screen. And I'm going to say a word about the first point on fragmentation, and then I'll turn it over to Paul to talk about the second and third points about race and organized economic interests. But on the first point, one of the ways in which the American political economy really stands out is for its extraordinarily fragmented political economic landscape. Right? The US is characterized by a really extreme separation of powers at the federal level, including a really unusually powerful, but also highly politicized judicial branch. And as such, it contains a huge number of veto points. And that, of course, has enormous implications for politics and for policymaking, because this status quo bias really works to the advantage of precisely those actors who want to block change because they already occupy a privileged position either in the market or in politics. And this is, of course, goes back to Jacob Hacker's, I think, really powerful concept of drift. But this fragmented landscape doesn't just block change or prevent change. It also acts as a powerful filter that really privileges certain kinds of actors over other kinds of actors. And who it privileges, of course, is organized political actors that have abundant resources, that have a very long time horizon, and that can actually maneuver effectively across this entire multi-venue landscape. Then beyond this, the US also features a really high degree of vertical fragmentation, right? Including a form of federalism that really decentralizes authority, but without a whole lot of coordination or revenue sharing. And that, of course, invites all sorts of venue shopping by the most powerful actors. And it's also a system, as you see on this slide, that much more than other countries delegates really important issue areas to local governance. And that has really encouraged opportunity hoarding and has contributed, among other things, to really extremely durable space-based racial inequalities. And with that, I'll hand off to Paul.
Great. I think you need to unshare, Kathy. There we go. Great. Is that me? Yes. Okay. How do I make that bigger? Sorry. Okay. I feel like this should be bigger on my screen. Can you guys see the slides reasonably well?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So good morning from here. I really wish I could be there with you guys, not just virtually, but in person. I miss London. I miss the LSE. But it's great to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about this project. And I want to keep this really short because I think we're most interested in hearing people's reactions and questions. To emphasize 2 points at the outset, which are ones that Kathy has already touched upon. The first is to acknowledge that this broad project that we're involved with and this volume itself, I think it's fair to say that they're primarily aimed at an audience of American political scientists. It is a really shocking thing to see the way in which issues of political economy essentially have been sidelined by mainstream scholars of American politics. It's a cautionary tale. If we had more time, we could talk about how that happened, why that happened. But I sometimes say that American political scientists know more about the German Employers Federation, thanks to people like Kathy, than we do about the US Chamber of Commerce, even though the US Chamber of Commerce is extraordinarily powerful. And we have literally thousands of political scientists studying the American political system. So something has gone seriously amiss here, and we are trying energetically to get students of American politics to think more broadly about their subject matter. And that brings me to the second point, which is, I think, in addition to just a substantive focus on the kinds of issues that we focus on in this book, we have a very different conception of power underlying our analyses than the one that I think is typically advanced or is just implicit in a lot of work that goes on in American political science, nicely captured by what Kathy referred to as last mile politics, to focus on just what happens at the very end of a very long process. And my favorite quote for capturing this comes from the American political scientist E.E. Schatzsnyder, who famously said, "Some things get organized into politics and some things get organized out." And in many ways, our inquiry is trying to understand what gets organized in, what gets organized out. And I would add to that, what gets organized to where, right? So what venues get to deal with particular issues. Whoops, lost my slides. I do not know what's happening here. Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can get this. That's not good.
I think if you hit slideshow.
There we go.
There you go.
Slideshow. I'm not seeing the link for doing that. Shoot. Where am I going to find that?
Well, an alternative, if you can't find it, Paul, Kathy can do it, and you can just say, move on the slide, move from slide to slide.
And I think I got it now.
You got it.
Sorry.
No,
It's
no.
not actually doing this quite the way I want it to. Well, let's go to full screen and see if that helps. That looks better. Okay, so this is a slide that Kathy started with or ended with.
I don't see it, Paul.
You guys are not seeing it?
I think it's disappeared.
All right. Is it back now? Can you guys put it up?
Yes, we can, but
I don't know why I'm
think
having this.
just let Kathy go ahead and share from her end, and then just tell her when to move the slides.
Okay. Can you
Yeah,
do
Mark-
that, Kathy? Do you have my slides?
Otherwise, we'll do it at our end. Kathy, you're muted, I think. There it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's mine, but I don't know whether I'm going to be able to advance these slides or not. Let's see.
If you can't, we'll do it from here.
Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah, okay, somebody moved. Okay, so this kind of allocation of political authority has huge consequences. And David, in his work with Nikki Lacey, really got us thinking seriously about this, and particularly about the effect that it has on racial inequality in the United States and racial politics. And there are a couple of important dimensions of this that are explored in the book, and especially now I don't have time to go into them here, but it both relates to the way the social provision is organized in the United States. We describe a doubly racially bifurcated welfare state. That's because the public welfare state of the United States has a pretty clear racial division in it, with minorities largely relegated, especially historically, to the means tested portions of the welfare state rather than the social insurance state. But then on top of that, as Jacob and other scholars have explored, there's a private welfare state heavily subsidized by government through tax subsidies. And that private welfare state, largely designed around those in the most favorable employment positions, also relegates African Americans and other minorities to the periphery rather than the core of social provision. And then on top of that, the way in which so much authority is allocated to local governments with very little cross financial subsidization creates enormous incentives for what's called opportunity hoarding, and the flip side of opportunity hoarding, which is what Veshel Weaver and Joe Soss have called race class subjugated communities. So the argument we're developing here is that the racial inequalities are constitutive of the American political economy, and they are very, very deeply embedded. I'm not going to talk about this slide. Most of you know about this, but one manifestation of this is just the stunning difference in incarceration rates across countries, and of course, this is highly impactful on minority communities in the United States. The final point that Kathy mentioned in terms of the broad themes that we were emphasizing throughout the book is the impact of fragmented organizations. American economic organizations, much more fractured than is the norm across the world of affluent democracies. And that is true both on the employer side and on the side of labor. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but just to emphasize, one important consequence of this is that having fragmented, in many cases, weak organizations is going to interact with our multi-venue politics. The fact that political authority is dispersed so widely, so the capacity of groups to operate effectively in multiple venues and to coordinate their activities across multiple venues makes an extraordinary difference. This is very difficult for labor to do in the American context. It's easier for employers to do, not pandering, but there's a wonderful chapter by Kathy and Sabeel Rahman in the book, the first of its kind, really, that tries to explore the impact of the courts on the American political economy. And that little graph in the bottom right corner of this slide basically is the win rate for employer interests at the Supreme Court over time. And as they outline in that paper, there's been a very concerted effort to tilt, and concerted and successful effort to tilt the legal environment, which is, of course, extremely important in the American context, more and more in favor of business over time. So that's just one example. I think, one of the most tangible examples in the book of how we try to pursue this metapolitics and really think about how the fractured structure of American institutions and American interests leads to particular dynamics over time. And just to give you a little bit of a feel, we're having to go through so much material so quickly. Just going to mention four of the contributions to the volume. There's a wonderful paper by Kelly and Morgan, which tries to explore how that veto-ridden system that Kathy described leads to high inequality and gridlock at the national level. A wonderful paper by Jessica Traunstein, which looks particularly focused on local political economy and this idea of opportunity hoarding and its flip side of these race class subjugated communities, how that developed in the United States. Jake Grumbach and I have a paper on what we call red state political economies, in which we try to explore why, even as Republicans have gained power in many states, they have pursued policies that have left their states gasping for air, in many cases falling further and further behind economically. And finally, two papers on the knowledge economy, one by David Soskis and one by Lucy Barnes, which explore the threats to the American knowledge economy that come out of the kinds of dynamics that are introduced in those other three papers. Not going to have time to talk about this. Maybe we can get into it a little bit more in Q&A. But I think there is evidence suggesting that where the U.S. had a huge lead, and David's paper explains why this was the case, the U.S. had a huge lead in many of the cutting edge areas of the knowledge economy, that much of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure that's necessary to sustain and further develop that knowledge economy over time is slipping in the United States. you could, the dots on this slide, which I think, at least on mine, you can't actually see it, but that's college completion among those over 50. And you can see, which is sort of a snapshot of the past, right? It tells you, yeah.
Well, they can't see that, and that particular slide would be
Yeah.
great if they could. If you stop sharing, Kathy can share and show it.
Okay. I can
And-
try to do that.
Yeah.
Just gonna see if
Just
I
go under share screen and stop.
Yeah, I'm not even getting the, let me see if I'm not even getting.
I'll tell you what.
Okay, now I'm out.
Okay, actually, Kathy, just let the LSE events team just do it. They'll just run it, put it up and go right to that slide. There it is.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. That's
Magic.
so much better. And I apologize. I'm not quite sure what happened with this. Okay, so the circles basically give you a snapshot of what things look like in the 1960s or 1970s, right? Because that's college completion rates among people who are now approaching retirement age. The triangles tell you how people are doing, for younger cohorts now. And you can see that the US was ahead with respect to the circles, but many countries are now passing the United States in percentage of college completion, and several papers in the volume try to explore why that's happening. Okay, next slide. And we're just going to skip over this. It shows the decline of the federal contribution to research and development, same kind of story. Next slide. Okay, so just a couple of things to close. I think it would be fair for comparativists and Londoners to wonder, like, okay, well, what's in it for us? And because really the project is designed to try to change the conversation within American political science and within American political science discussions of the United States. But we do think that there are a number of important themes that are really important for political scientists more broadly, for political economists more broadly, and for comparativists to think about. Some of them are listed in this slide. There's a lot of attention to the spatial dimensions of political economy, which are quite striking, the changes in the geographic distribution of economic and political rewards in the United States. We've emphasized this point about multi-venue politics and the importance of paying attention to venues that often don't get as much attention, like the courts. We have a very different take on how to think about the relationship between economic and political inequality that really draws on this idea of last mile politics. Next, and I think last slide. So for comparativists, I think, first of all, we need a clear read on the American political economy. It's actually hard to do comparative political economy, we think, without having a clear read on the American political economy. And the US, I think even comparative is too often kind of grouped together with other liberal market economies. And of course, there's reason to do that, to develop these kinds of typologies. But it can also obscure important differences within particular clusters of countries. And I think the more you look at the United States, the more you can see how distinctive it actually is from a political economy like the British one. And in addition, this last point, I think there are a number of themes here which actually deserve more serious attention within comparative political economy, not just with respect to the United States. And so hopefully we can provide a little bit of input, a little bit of insight in how to look at some of those issues better. Okay, so I'll stop there and hope we have enough time for some good Q&A.
We do. We have plenty of time here. Thanks so much for both of you for that kind of the quick rundown of the book's core arguments, why they're important. I want to just welcome folks on the platform from Hong Kong, South Africa, Poland, India, Germany, Italy, Colombia, Canada, South Korea, and the UK. So we have a great group out there. There's questions are starting to come in. while they're rolling in, I'm going to pose the first question. I'm also going to invite my colleague, Professor David Soskis, who is also one of the contributors, as you mentioned in the volume, to add his voice if the spirit moves him. I actually have a number of questions, but I had a chance to read the introductory chapter, which is excellent, and some of the some of the stimulating chapters as well. And I highly recommend the book. It's trending on Amazon for folks out there, it turns out right now. One of the things that the book raises, it seems to me, and Paul alluded to this in his presentation, is why there is no vibrant political economy tradition in the United States. Now, one thing is for sure, I think, it's not for lack of interest or trying. I mean, one thinks back to the important work in the 1970s and 80s on the political business cycle, whether it's Tufte or Hibbs or others, or the important work of scholars, early scholars, I would say, in the APD, American Political Development tradition. But still, it's clear, as you point out, that the field is impoverished, at least relative to its CPE counterpart in Europe. And so the question I guess I have, and would invite you to say something about here to address, is why? What explains it? I mean, does it have something to do with ideology and the close association that political economy had at one point in the United States and elsewhere with Marxism that resonated in a different way in the US? Does it have more to do with the hold of behavioralism? It has long exercised a hold on American political science, but I would say it spiked after the end of the Cold War, since the 90s. And, what kind of explains its relative absence? I wonder if you could say, just a few words. I would just like to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, maybe I'll take that one, Kathy. So I think there are three things going on. I think the first is that within American universities, you have a lot of students who want to study American politics. And so political science departments, a third of the faculty are teaching American politics. And so that's just a ton of people studying American politics, given the scale of the university system in the US. And so what emerges out of that, I think, is an extreme division of labor. So people study Congress, or they study the presidency, or they study public opinion. Many of them study public opinion. And so there's this tendency to kind of slice things up in a way that it really takes you away from the kinds of approaches that we're talking about and that are conventional in political economy. The second thing, I think, is the behavioral revolution and the emphasis on data and generating as much data as possible as kind of the holy grail. And so that emerges and I think becomes kind of a tail that wags the dog. And then I do think the last thing is this normative point that American political scientists eager to maintain kind of a norm of neutrality have retreated into a kind of antiseptic view of politics, which actually doesn't talk about substance very much. Right. So you don't talk about Republicans and Democrats. You don't talk about business and labor. You talk about parties, and you talk about voters, and you talk about opinion. So all of this has an effect of both narrowing the subject matter and taking most of the substance out of it.
Kathy, you want to add anything?
No, that sounds right to me. I mean, there has been a move in comparative political economy to sort of emphasize elections and voting behavior, and there has been that move. But it matters a lot that happened against the backdrop of a really already very well established body of work that has that looks at producer groups, and so it sort of by its nature starts with that and then moves into the electoral politics from a very different from a very different vantage point. And so I think that, you know, there is a lot of people are talking about a sort of the Americanization of European political economic research, but I think it's really different because the starting point is so different, and because we do have, I mean, comparativists start with this notion that organized interests are a part of the landscape that you can scarcely ignore. So it ends up in a very different place, even if there are some overtones in that direction now, I think.
Great. So we've got a number of questions coming in. David, is there anything you want to add to that?
Okay, let me just say one thing. For me, working with the editors was the most I mean, I don't think they knew that they were blowing my mind, but I was shaken all over the place by having to thinking about the United States, and it really emerges that the United States system, it's called complex of systems, works so differently from all the things I'd been working on in the past that yeah, well, I just like to thank Kathy and Paul, since they're here, very, very much indeed. And go and buy the book.
So look, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in. I'm actually going to put 3 of them to you in a bundle right now. One is from Avram Libanau, who's an MSc student in political science and political economy here at the LSE. How would you characterize, speaking of, I suppose, venues, how would you characterize the role of the media in the context of your different zones of influence and forums of political economy? So a question about the media and how it fits into your template. From another LSE student, Fabian Kraken, a current contemporary issue, how would you explain the current situation in Congress regarding the 2 Biden packages, especially thinking of the left-wing Democratic Party, AOC, voting against the first package and what their incentives for doing so were? How realistic is it that the second package will be passed in Congress? So, you know, perhaps just how does the framework help us understand the internal politics that are taking place, let's say, within the Democratic Party right now over these very, very large packages? And then finally, a challenge from a colleague and I suspect friend, Jonathan Hopkin. This looks great. And I think an EPE volume for Europe would be an important thing to do as well. My question, though, is about authoritarianism. Does the increasing threat to democracy from the armed right imply that we need to move beyond standard CPE of rich democracies focus? So the media, what's happening inside Congress with Biden's very large stimulus packages right now and what it reveals and whether it can be accommodated within your framework. And then a question about whether or not we need to be thinking about authoritarianism as well as democracy in doing CPE and political economy generally. Okay.
Kathy, you want to start?
I'll start with the question about on media. So that's an element that didn't. There are so many aspects that we should have and could have dealt with in a book, but there are a couple of things that we sort of had to bracket, so to speak, not because they're not important, but because there's just limited space. But media would definitely be one of them. But there is it's clearly a really important factor. I mean, I'll mention one work that is kind of in the spirit of the work that we're trying to advocate, and it's a wonderful piece by Ellen Jacobs, among others, that really talks about the way in which the media amplify and really report on certain aspects of the state of the economy to the expense of others. And in particular, you have sort of constant drumming of how the stock market is doing, and so this is hugely emphasized in the media, and that of course affects the way that people think about the economic situation. And what's not sort of promoted or not talked about to the same extent is of course things like real wages in the United States economy. These are things that are simply invisible to people. And so the sort of bias in the media toward the interests of, or the kinds of economic indicators that matter most to people, to the wealthy, are really amplified and influence the entire discourse. I mean, there's a reason why Republicans are constantly they don't want to talk about, and this is getting a little bit into the Biden packages. They don't want to talk about the substance of any of this stuff. All they want to talk about is the dollar figure. It's like, it's all about the cost of this thing and what it and how that translates in. That's going to translate into these horrible outcomes for the average American and inflation and so forth. And not talking about the sort of substance of some of this stuff. But Paul can speak more authoritatively to what's going to happen in Congress and maybe also to the populism question. That's something that we have been actually thinking quite a lot about.
Yeah. So the question about Congress, and I will say I think it's like 50-50 whether they pass some version of the reconciliation bill or not. But our analysis is not really pitched at that level of granularity, I guess I would say. If you take a step back and think about what's going on, the two things that I would want to highlight is, first of all, it is extremely difficult to pass any kind of ambitious policy package in Washington, right? Everything has to run through the reconciliation process because of the filibuster, and because it is impossible that any kind of really expansive policies are going to be supported by the minority party. And because of the structure of the U.S. Senate, you end up in a situation where Joe Manchin, a senator from West Virginia, a coal state that Trump carried by 30 points or more, is the pivotal vote in the Senate, right? So that's a pretty astonishing arrangement that organizes some things in and organizes other things out. Given that, I actually think it's surprising that Democrats have put together as ambitious a package as they did, even though it may not pass at all, and much of the most interesting stuff ended up on the cutting room floor because of one or two Democratic senators. But I think there's an interesting analysis to be carried out about why much of the Democratic Party seems to have moved in a significantly more progressive direction since, say the Obama presidency. The only I agree with Kathy about the media article. There are a ton of things that we do not cover in this book because it's just a huge topic. There's not much in the book on finance. There's almost nothing on macroeconomics. There's nothing on IPE really. There are a ton of things that one would need to talk about, but we thought 15 chapters and an epilogue was probably enough for a first take. But I mentioned one other media piece that I think is super interesting for thinking about this, which is this book, Network Propaganda, which came out a few years ago. Yochai Benkler, and I always forget the co-author, and my cat has arrived. It really explores the asymmetry of the media market and has actually a nice kind of political economy approach about why right-wing media has evolved in a different way than mainstream and more liberal media. And it's quite striking in their data. And that gets to this last point about authoritarianism, which is something I think the questioner is absolutely right to say that is an enormously important question. It's something, Jacob and our most recent book is largely on this subject. There are a growing number of political scientists who are interested in the issue of democratic backsliding in the United States. Strikingly, most of them are not mainstream Americanists. They're comparativists like Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky. or they're kind of more historically oriented political development scholars like Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman. But I think one place where APE has a really important contribution to make, as Kathy suggested, is in understanding the rise of right-wing populism and its nature. And I think there has been a tendency within American political science to sort of set up the discussion of right-wing populism or Trumpism as a debate between whether it's race or economic anxiety that is driving this. And they put these two variables into a kind of a cage match competition and say only one of these variables can be the explanation. Whereas I think our view would be that the structure of the American political economy is very much involved with both the generation of economic anxiety and the kind of racial resentments which are so prevalent in American politics. So the attempt to say that it's one or the other, I think, is it's just a false dichotomy.
Great. So we've got a bunch of other questions here. I'm going to group a few again. One comes from Harriet Auld, who's a sixth form student of history, politics, and economics. Would you categorize any other rich democracies to have entrenched racial inequality caused by the organization of powers or other factors that you address or identify in the book? So to pick up that theme and put it in kind of a larger comparative context. A question that comes from Stuart Wood, who is a member of parliament here. And the question is, decentralized and fragmented political authority, is often seen by the first generation of varieties of capitalism writers as a source of obstruction to change. And you echo this, but can decentralized plural sites of public power also be a source of economic innovation and dynamism in the US through regulatory entrepreneurialism, given the multiple sites of power? I think this actually reflected this view in David's piece, actually, in the volume. But in any event, to maybe say something about that. And then I want to invite you, Paul, because you just flagged that it was a question that was on my mind, but a student has picked this up, and maybe to just say a little bit more about it. Ruodi, who is in the IPE program here, the MSc IPE at the LSE, asks a question, a Susan Strange related question, not surprisingly, I suppose. Could you define metapolitics? Could one, in relation to the structures of power in the world economy? So a kind of, and I think it raises a kind of, I would like to just kind of push that question a little bit, because it also struck me when I was going through the volume. I agree, you can't do everything, but there's very little about the world economy. And just to add to that, there's very little about geopolitics. And we know that both of those things, they're not the last mile, they're sometimes the starting gate in terms of shaping what goes on in the United States. So I guess the question is some thoughts about, and you must have had conversations about this, like how, as you move the project forward, because this is a living, breathing project, how you hope to bring that into the project to, kind of flesh out the agenda that you've already set. So 3 very different kinds of issues for you. And we have 6 minutes. So you'll need to be brief, because I want to ask one final little question. Somebody posed it before we close.
Okay, Kathy, so I'm just going to take Stuart's question and leave the rest for you. I'll try to be very quick. First, hi, Stuart. It's been many, many years, but it's nice to connect, at least in this strange way. But the answer to your question, yes. And David's paper brings this out, I think, very nicely, and some of his other work as well. The ways in which decentralization and the kind of competitive decentralization that exists in American federalism it can be a spark for innovation. I don't think there's any question about that. And so that's laid out in David's chapter, and I suppose it's still the case. But we argue in the book, first of all, that there may be a reason to worry quite a bit about the declining support for innovation, that these kind of competitive dynamics are giving way to things that are more sclerotic, if you will, that advantage entrenched interests within the knowledge economy that may not necessarily be giving rise to the most innovation. And at the same time, that there are other really important trends in American politics that are undercutting support for some of the key policy features that you need to maintain the knowledge economy.
Yeah, so just a couple of words on the other two questions, and maybe one additional sentence on that one. Just starting with that one, I mean, I think if what you mean is innovation in terms of sort of Brandeis's laboratories of democracy kind of innovation, in addition to sort of technological innovation and so forth, that's where the particular variety of localism that we have in the U.S. has some really important limits. And you can see this in COVID, where you have state governments coming in and preempting local governments that want to do something sort of particularly progressive. And so we think that that's possible, but it turns out that it much more fuels kind of race to the bottom, deregulatory races to the bottom in many cases. You saw this with, the advance of Uber across the United States, among other ways. Are there other places that have these entrenched racial divisions? This is one area that, I mean, the U.S. has a particularly distinctive form of this, but this is one of those areas where we think, going forward, European political economists are going to have to be looking much more carefully at these kinds of entrenched cleavages as well. I will say on some dimensions, on some aspects of this, the appropriate comparator countries are not necessarily like incarceration rates. If you want to compare the United States to other countries on incarceration, you do not want to be looking at the rich democracies. You want to be looking at a whole different set of countries like South Africa and Brazil. And it's really striking the way that we sort of by default look to the other rich democracies. And on some of these dimensions, particularly on that, on incarceration, that's just not the right set of comparisons, which itself speaks volumes about the American political economy. And then on, on metapolitics, there's so much more to be said. And in fact, there's probably another volume to be done. The US is just such a distinctive, it's not just the biggest of the rich democracies, it's really a very distinctive one, and it's one that really sets the tone and decides the rules on a lot of important political economic decisions. Mark Schwartz has a wonderful paper in the volume that talks about the way in which sort of the United States sort of magnifies or sort of exports its patent regime in ways that really protect American business interests. And so there's tons more to be said about that.
Right. So we've got 2 minutes. I've saved this question. This is just kind of by way of giving you a last bite at the apple before we conclude. It's a question from John Newham, a London University graduate. So what would the founding fathers make of how political economy has evolved in the United States? One of you want to take it home with that, or both? Closing thought before we wrap up here.
Well, of course, that is kind of unanswerable.
Yes,
but I'll just, Madison, late in his life, wrote this very interesting letter in which he basically looked ahead to 100 years from when he was writing, and thinking at that point, the U.S. will be industrialized. Basically, there was no longer going to be a rural and agriculturally based country. It's going to be much more populous. And he kind of wondered aloud in that piece about how well the Constitution would work in that context. I think I think, well, so of course, there are many ways in which the Constitution has evolved. But one thing that has clearly happened with the rise of much stronger political parties than they anticipated, and with the emergence of something like the filibuster, is the complete incapacity, I would say, of the federal government to really respond in any kind of robust way to challenges that it confronts. And people forget that the Constitution was a reaction to the complete failure of the Articles of Confederation. Madison, Hamilton, Washington, all of them wanted a much stronger federal government precisely for the reason that they couldn't manage the political economy they had in the 18th century without a much more robust capacity for national action. So I would like to think that that is what they would highlight.
Kathy, a final thought. We're in overtime here, and that's fine.
Just that there's one aspect, though, that is a continuity, and that is some of these race-based inequalities that were sort of baked in from the very beginning. So there's a way in which Paul is right that so much has changed and in ways that were unanticipated. But there's one that is just a constant in the American political economy, and what's striking is the durability of this and its ability to sort of survive massive changes in the economy and in politics.
So folks, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the platform. Great pleasure to have an opportunity to listen to Paul Pierson and Kathy Thelen. Paul and Kathy, thanks so much for joining us to share your thoughts about the American political economy and how we should start thinking about it. Couldn't be more timely. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks so much.